For the past 4 years, I've single-mindedly pursued being in the mountains. I'm turning 25, and I've added absolutely nothing to my resume besides a list of peaks that I've climbed. Climbing mountains and pushing my body. That's my entire life. When someone asks, what do you do? My answer is, I live in a van, and I climb mountains. I am definitionally a dirtbag. And I must admit, I'm so stoked that this is my life. So what exactly does being a dirtbag entail? Well, essentially every day I get out and go do something. My ideal day includes carrying only some food and water and going to the mountains for hours at a time. The type of terrain that I encounter dictates what my day is going to be like. Sometimes it's giant fields of talus and crumbling scree slopes. Sometimes it's bomber granite. Sometimes ripper trails. Regardless, I do my best to move fast through the land and experience as much of it as I can. After several hours in the mountains, I arrive back in my van and I immediately begin recovering, also I can do it again the next day. This film explores what my life is like and how I view the mountains after dirtbagging for 4 years. So let's explore. It makes sense to start with how I start every day. Going uphill is hard. All of life is spent fighting gravity, and going up a hill makes that battle feel very apparent. But even though it's a struggle, going uphill helps reduce the world down into 2 very basic components: breathing and moving. When I'm working hard on a trail, I can push myself enough not to have the brain capacity to focus on much else. But most of what I do doesn't actually involve being on a trail at all. It involves finding my own way and doing what inspires me the most. Now, whether you call it experience or stupidity is totally up to you, but I find myself quite often on slopes that no one in their right mind would want to venture onto. And I do this time and time again, voluntarily, not only for the challenge, but for the opportunity to express myself and push my limits out a little further. It's way more interesting to be given the opportunity to critically analyze what I'm doing rather than just following in everyone else's footsteps on a trail. And plus, it's just plain fun.
Well, that was messed up.
To have the heart, lungs, and legs all work in tandem to propel the body upwards. It's a beautiful thing. But there's one aspect of fighting gravity that falls into a completely different category. One that's much slower, more methodical, and requires more acute focus. Now I want to be transparent here. I don't personally consider this climbing. To me, it's just scrambling. All it really is a natural extension of going uphill. At some point, the mountain gets steeper and you're forced to use all your limbs. Even though sometimes it's really steep, I don't consider it climbing because I don't use a rope. And I don't have any interest in scrambling up something that would make me want a rope. So even though it may appear quite involved, you have to keep in mind that I gradually moved my way onto this rock. I went through a checklist that I've memorized over the years, making sure it's safe, but perhaps more importantly, making sure that it's something that I really want to do. I recognize that the risk is a little more obvious. You're in steeper terrain, a fall would be worse. But that steeper terrain lends itself to slowing down and focusing on the fine details. Checking every hold and staying mentally tuned in. This is a very meditative experience. And that's why I choose to scramble, many times overtaking the easier path. And then eventually, there's no more uphill. There's just the top. Now, I've been on top of a lot of piles of rocks, and I've seen more than my share of views from up high. But every summit I've gone to, I've left. After taking in the majesty of the land, I collect myself, I breathe, and I move. I guess I should mention that I rarely just climb one mountain. It logically makes sense to link up mountains via ridgelines, and sometimes the ridgeline is the most inspiring part of the day. It's always a cool experience to be able to look down into the basins below, to feel like you're moving in the most efficient way possible through the mountains. But even though it might be the most efficient, that doesn't necessarily mean it's always the easiest. There's lots of types of terrain that I encounter on any given day, but I found out that the Rocky Mountains are pretty aptly named. Talus is essentially a giant field of different sized rocks, all perched against one another. Sometimes they're on a slope, sometimes not. Sometimes all those rocks move, and sometimes they don't. Hopping between them requires quite a bit of focus, since falling would be pretty bad. Of all the terrain that I've encountered, I think I like a good field of talus the most. After I've climbed however many peaks I'm climbing that day, I drop down into the basin and follow the water back to where I started. The initial drop coming off a mountain can be pretty involved. I always try to take the harder way up and the easier way down, but most of the time there's just no trail, and so dropping straight down just makes the most sense. As with everything else, the mountains dictate how easy this is going to be. Going downhill is in many ways harder than going up. Having to actively fight gravity while moving with it, that's difficult. It's often easier to just surrender to its pull and go with it. I've learned that going downhill on foot is sometimes not that much different than skiing. Let gravity pull and flow down the mountain the easiest way possible. At some point, the terrain starts to flatten out, and all those lakes and streams, all the water that I've been eyeing from the ridge, I finally get to see it up close. Eventually, I end up back on a trail, and I tell myself that no matter how much it hurts, no matter how hard the day has been to that point, there's absolutely no excuse not to run down the trail. And so I run. Sometimes after already traveling for 7-8 hours. Those runs are the most rewarding part of the experience for me. It means that I made it through the day, and that I was able to overcome whatever obstacles I encountered, and it means that I was able to push my body to go the distance required. And that's what I do nearly every single day. Being able to move and keep on moving all day is a very primal experience. And even though it's hard to push day after day, there's something about breathing and moving that just feels biologically right. It feels like the most natural activity. It's truly a shame to think that we as a species have lost touch with this more primal side in the present day. But I understand that we're biologically programmed to avoid doing the hard things. Despite that, I feel that breathing and moving has added a depth and richness to my life. And I suppose that's why I'm still doing it. So I'm turning 25, and I am a dirtbag. I know at some point in my life I won't be able to do this, but right now I can, and so I'm fully committed to it. This is the path that I'm on, and I'm going to continue to pursue this path until the end.
my things though. Ow. That's gonna leave some cuts. Well, back to the shot.